So the overall topic is the assassination of President Lincoln. He's going to have some plans for the South before this happens to him, and I think you need to know those prior. Now, let's talk about the post-war South. What does post-war mean? Afterwards, okay? Now, we're talking about the post-war South. We're talking about what the South looked like after firing stopped during the Civil War. And where were most of the battles fought? In the South. So they're going to have a majority of the issue here. Okay? Now, you got to remember that after the Civil War, the South had completely collapsed, both economically and socially. And we'll kind of give you some examples of those later on. Once beautiful cities like Charleston, Richmond, and Atlanta, who were the pride of their states, were all gutted and in ruins. Those proud cities looked terrible and were war-torn. And one man from Atlanta, upon returning back to the city he once lived in, was quoted as saying, "Hell has laid her egg, and right here it hatched." So again, beautiful cities such as Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, all these beautiful cities were gutted and in ruins. And one man from Atlanta who returned to the town he once lived in after the Civil War was quoted as saying, quote, "Hell has laid her egg, and right here it hatched." Hell has laid her egg, and right here it hatched. Now, there were three specific ways of life that were really negatively affected by the Civil War in the South. Okay? Three specific ways of life that was very much disrupted in the South, very negative. And the first one in the South was social institutions that were negatively impacted by the Civil War in the South. Social institutions. So Aurora, my dear, what is a social institution?
Like a place where people can go together and do town.
And do what?
Like where people in the same town go.
Yeah, and well, give me an example of what that
Like
is.
a church.
Church should be a social institution, right? What you're sitting in right now would be a social institution, a school. So, social institutions were very much affected negatively as a result of the Civil War. Not only were churches and schools battered and in ruins, but if you have no schools, you have no educational system, right? And a lot of the teachers that were male that taught school in the South were killed during the Civil War, and I'm sure there were some innocent bystanders that were women that were killed. So when I talk about the impact on social institutions, your churches and schools are battered and left in ruins. Your educational system in the South is in total chaos. Most of your teachers have been killed, wounded, or missing because of the Civil War. So there's your first example of how the way of life was disrupted in the South after the Civil War. The second example was economic life was disrupted. Economic life. Jaden, what's an example of economic life?
Making money, so having a job.
Okay, so,
Farming.
okay, we'll get to that. That'll not yet on farming. Economic life, and it does tie in, but what's an example of economic life? What's an example of that? What's an example of an economic life in world?
Owning a business.
Ace Hardware, yeah. So businesses, think about businesses in the South. If they were not torn down and ruined, they were certainly ruined by inflation. Remember, the South was bankrupt. So businesses, what keeps the businesses money? Banks. So the banks were also either ruined by inflation or simply their building was physically destroyed. So banks and businesses had to lock their doors, either ruined by inflation or totally destroyed by devastation. Now, we told you that most of the factories were in the North during the Civil War, but that didn't mean the South didn't have some. And those factories were smokeless. They were ruined. Okay? So the second example of economic life being disrupted is factories were smokeless, they were silent, either they were torn down or tore apart. So there was no factory system in the South after the Civil War, which is an example of economic life. And what did General Sherman do in his march to the sea besides eat everybody's food, live off the land, and make Georgia howl? What did he do along the route? He just, right, including what? The railroad system. So the transportation system was in chaos because the Union had destroyed the transportation system in their march to the sea. So we talked about social institutions in the South that were affected negatively by the Civil War, economic life. But what's the most important business in the South? You were getting to that, but not yet. Agriculture. So agriculture is going to be the third way of life that was affected negatively by the Civil War. Now we're going to get some examples of agriculture. And Jaden, we're going to save yours for last. The once white cotton fields of the South are now growing a large harvest of weeds. Okay, those beautiful cotton fields in the South prior to the Civil War are completely torn up and all that's in is weeds.
Was transportation part of economics?
Yes. Now, so they want to start over, Juliana. What are they going to need to start over their crops? Before that, you can throw all the water. Seeds, yeah. And seeds were very, very scarce. They couldn't find any seed to really get going again because it all had been destroyed. As Caitlin said, the Union destroyed anything they thought would benefit the South, including their seeds, so they had very few seeds for crops. What else would you need in an agricultural area besides cotton or seeds for crops? What might else you need? What? Well, we'll get to that one. That was Jaden's deal. Who's going to pull those plows for you? Yeah, there isn't any livestock. Where's all the livestock? Killed, right? They killed them all. So there was no livestock in the South. Another example of agriculture. Livestock was either driven away by Union soldiers or killed. And then we get to the most important part, which Jaden said, slave labor is gone because the slaves have been freed. So you have no slave labor. So the three ways of life that were really affected negatively by the Civil War in the South were social institutions, churches, schools, and the educational system, economic life, banks and businesses, factories, and the transportation system all ruined, and agriculture, cotton fields, harvesting weeds, no seeds for crops, no livestock, all driven away or killed, and there was no more slave labor. Now, whose job is it going to be to get this South back on track? President Lincoln. And he's going to have to do that in kind of a tenuous way. The first order of business is to try to figure out how he's going to allow Southern citizens to become citizens of the Union again, and how he's going to allow Southern states to come into the Union again as well. He's got to figure both of those out. So President Lincoln will have to develop a plan for the reconstruction of the South, which is going to cover both the readmission of Southern citizens and the readmission of Southern states. Now let's talk about the citizens first. What are you going to have to do if you're a Confederate or a Southerner to get back in good with the Union? What do you think you're going to have to do? Right. If you're a Southern citizen, you're going to be required to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. Now, if you take that oath of allegiance to the Union, are you not agreeing that you're going to accept all of the Union's federal laws, right? Which include what that you're not used to? No slavery, the abolishment of slavery. So, in order to get back in as a citizen, you were going to have to sign an oath pledging your loyalty to the Union, and when you did that, you had to basically tell them that we will abide by all federal laws now, including the abolitionists' view of slavery. No more slavery. Okay? But Lincoln wasn't willing to give that to every single Southern citizen. And you know what you give somebody when they do something like that for you? You give them amnesty or a pardon. So Lincoln decided he would pardon some, not all, of Southern citizens, and they would receive amnesty or a pardon if they took an oath of allegiance to the Union and agreed to promise to follow all federal laws, including those laws that abolished slavery. But he didn't give it to every single Southerner. There were some Southern citizens that were not given a pardon or amnesty from Lincoln. So, Nick, what type, if you're Abraham Lincoln, what type of Southern citizen are you not going to give amnesty to? Good guess, but not true. Good guess, though. Because you'd be giving amnesty to nobody. Right. But that's a good guess. Outlaws that did what? How about outlaws? I wouldn't know if you call them outlaws, but he was not going to give amnesty to any Confederates who mistreated Union prisoners of war. Okay, he was not going to give amnesty to any Confederate soldiers or government officials that abused prisoners of war. That's good, Lily, because actually that's the one nobody gets. You got that right off the bat. So again, citizens who mistreated prisoners of war during the Civil War would not be given amnesty. Who else wouldn't you give amnesty to? Kyra? You're Lincoln. Who do you not want to give amnesty to? Well, close. What specific people might not you give amnesty to?
The previous government of the Confederacy.
Close. Those who worked for the Union government that left and went to work for the Confederate government were not given amnesty. So if you left a position in the Union federal government and served in the Confederate government, that didn't mean you were fighting in the war, you were simply part of the government, then you would not be given amnesty. Who might be your best example of that? No, he's not in the government. You're getting it. We're going to get there though. Jefferson Davis, right? You think Jefferson Davis is going to get amnesty? No, he left the federal government and became president of the Confederacy. Now we'll get to Arroyo's comment. Is Robert E. Lee given amnesty? No, because they didn't give amnesty to high-ranking officials in the military, such as generals. So the three Confederate citizens that Lincoln would not give amnesty to were those that were proven to have mistreated prisoners of war, those that left the federal government and joined the government of the Confederacy, and those higher-ranking officials of the Confederate military, which means technically Robert E. Lee would not be given amnesty. Now, this is Lincoln's plan. Does that mean this happened yet? This is his plan, okay? We'll talk about that. So, now we've covered the citizens. Now we've got to cover out how Lincoln was planning to bring states back into the Union. Now, would he want to do that? Would he want to make it easy or hard, Elisa, to bring a state back into the Union? Why would he want to make it hard? That's what every kid says. Why would they want to make it hard? What was his goal by having a civil war? To preserve the Union. Well, can you preserve the Union if you don't let these states come back in? No, but Elisa, that's what everybody says. That would be your normal. He wanted to make it fairly easy for the states to get back in, because the only way he unites and preserves the Union is if he gets all these states back. So he made it really easy. Okay? And here was the deal. If 10% of the citizens that lived in those Confederate states would pledge their allegiance to the Union, he would let the state back in. Only 10%. Was that pretty lenient?
Yeah.
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. I'll make myself 18. 18 students in here today in the state of Dewar's 5th period AP US History. If only 10% of us had to agree to abide by the Union's say, that would be 1.8 people out of here is all. Less than 2 people would have to say, yeah, I'll pledge my allegiance, and you'll let them back in. That's how easy he wanted to make it, right? Because he wanted the states back in. Okay? That takes us to our next subtopic, though, is the radical Republicans. Remember we talked about them? One of the reasons why he passed the Emancipation Proclamation was because he wanted to please radical Republicans who thought he was too soft on the South. So as you can imagine, these radical Republicans are not going to agree with Lincoln's plan on letting states in. They're okay with letting individuals in. They think that's harsh enough, right? But the radical Republicans think he's too easy in letting the southern states in, because a lot of radical Republicans all they wanted to do was punish the South for what they had done, okay? So, there were two specific radical Republicans that were the biggest burr under Lincoln's saddle, so to speak. One was a senator from Massachusetts by the name of Charles Sumner, and the other one was a House of Representative from Pennsylvania, Thaddeus Stevens. So, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania were the two biggest burrs under Lincoln's saddle, so to speak, as far as not agreeing with what he was doing. These guys had kind of an interesting philosophy that you wouldn't probably think is normal. Both were concerned very much about these new freed slaves and how they would fit into society. Right? Yeah. Thaddeus Stevens was from Pennsylvania. But both were for trying to find a solution to these Negro slaves that are now free that they're going to inherit. What are these slaves known their whole life? Slavery. Do they know a trade? Do they know anything other than being told what to do and being beaten and having 3 meals a day if they do what they're supposed to do? And both of these guys were really concerned about how they were treated and what in the world we were going to do to make them know what to do with their newly found freedom. So, this is what they proposed. They wanted to see blacks equal to whites, which is really unusual back in those days. Those two felt that the South had treated blacks so poorly that the injustices and discriminations that black Southerners had faced during the Confederacy was outrageous. And they wanted to see equality among blacks, but they were maybe more concerned about educating these former slaves so they could function in the world of freedom. Does that make sense? If all of a sudden, all I ever did in my life was teach U.S. history, and all of a sudden they want me to fly the space shuttle, I'm going to be going, I have no idea what you're even talking about. That'd take some training, wouldn't it? Well, these freed slaves haven't done anything but been slaves their whole life. So they're going to be trained to be carpenters or metal workers or whatever so they can succeed. Otherwise, what do you inherit if you're in the North, if you don't educate them? Uneducated problems, right? Doesn't do them any good to give them their freedom, is their thought process, if we don't train them to do something they can do. Otherwise, they're a burden to themselves and us. Well, they couldn't agree with Lincoln. And so what Congress did, because they were ran by the radical Republicans, is they passed a piece of legislation called the Wade-Davis Bill, which is our next subtopic. So to get their way, the radical Republicans in Congress pushed a new bill through called the Wade-Davis Bill. Now, Aaron, considering what we've talked about, what do you think the Wade-Davis Bill is going to say? Well, but not, you're got on the right, but what's it going to do compared to what Lincoln wanted to do? It's going to be harsher on the South. So the Wade-Davis Bill is going to be harsher on the South for a southern state to get into the Union. And it's going to consist of 3 parts. There are 3 things that southern states are going to have to agree to if they're going to get into the Union. How many did Lincoln have? 1. This has 3. Now, ironically, they were okay with Lincoln's plan as part of the way you get back in. So number 1, or the first criteria, is 10% of the people that lived in the Confederate States that seceded from the Union had to agree to pledge their allegiance to the Union. So they left that in, but they added 2 more things. The first thing they added is they were concerned that if they let these Southern citizens in, what could they do? What could they do if they were citizens again? Vote and hold political office, right? So the second part of the Wade-Davis Bill is that only those Southerners that stayed loyal to the Union could ever hold political office. Okay? So if you weren't loyal to the Union, and you were a Southerner and they let you back in as a citizen, you could never in your life hold a political office. Does that make sense? Which gives control to the Southerners, gives political power to the Southerners that remained loyal. So if you weren't loyal and you came back in as a citizen, you could not run or hold political office. That was the second part. The third part made sense, but it wasn't enough. The third part of the Wade-Davis bill stated that every Southern state had to rewrite a new constitution. They had to rewrite a new state constitution. Does anybody want to guess what had to be in that constitution, that new constitution?
Maybe education of former slaves.
I said no.
Close so. Lily? What'd you say? They had to acknowledge in their state constitution that slaves were what, Gabe? Free. Yeah, they're going to educate them. But they wanted in every state constitution in the South that there was no question that those black people that lived in those states were free. Okay? So the third part of the Wade-Davis bill, it demanded that all Southern states establish new constitutions that would recognize the freedom of black Southerners. Okay, in July of 1864, that bill passes through both houses of Congress, and then it ends up where? On Lincoln's desk for his approval or his veto. So the Wade-Davis bill passes in both houses of Congress, and then it goes to the president's desk for his approval. But Lincoln reads it and he vetoes it for two reasons. Lee reads it and vetoes the Wade-Davis bill for two reasons. Anybody want to guess what they are?